Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we try to understand the vast and intricate world into which the gospel was first planted. And today we are doing a particularly fascinating deep dive into a civilization that really provides the cultural and the linguistic scaffolding of the entire New Testament era, the Greeks.
That's such an important point to make right at the start. I think when we picture the first century, most of us, our minds go to Roman legions, Roman roads, the iron fist of Roman law.
Right, the political power.
Exactly. And while that political and military reality was absolutely there, the deeper cultural currents, the intellectual architecture of that world was fundamentally Greek. We've been looking at a really detailed essay that highlights this exact point. If you really want to grasp the early church's successes and its struggles, and even the very words on the page of the New Testament, you have to understand the Greek spirit.
Its philosophy, its drive for wisdom.
And its common language.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So our mission today isn't just to give you a summary. We want to systematically unpack the insights from this material. We're going to, trace the historical roots and then really slow down to look at those specific challenging encounters the gospel had in places like Athens and Corinth.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, grasp the theological implications of God's timing, and then, and this is the most important part, draw out some practical lessons for us as believers trying to navigate our own culture today.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is always clarity, context, and application.
And setting that context really requires us to see the dual role Greece played in God's plan. I mean, on one hand, Greece gave this incredible cultural gift, a common language, a framework for thinking, a system of thought that sort of unified the Mediterranean world. It served as a divinely prepared channel for the gospel.
But on the other hand,
that very same love of human reason, of self-sufficiency, of philosophical debate, that presented one of the biggest spiritual challenges to the simple, radical message of the cross. It's really a study in how God uses both the channel and the challenge to get his purposes done.
okay, so let's unpack that historical context first. The essay really grounds us, reminding us that this isn't just about Socrates and Plato. It goes back much, much further. We're tracing the roots to the Mycenaean civilization. That's what, 1600 to 1100 BC?
Yeah, that's long before the classical thinkers we usually think of. It's so important to see the depth of this heritage. And while those roots are ancient, the cultural explosion, the identity we really recognize today that crystallized during the classical age, we're talking about the 5th and 4th centuries BC.
And that's when you see the rise of the polis, the city-state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The independent, self-governing city-state. It became the fundamental unit of Greek identity and politics, and it was a profoundly different idea than the huge, centralized empires that came before it.
And these cities weren't all the same, were they? The source really emphasizes that the early church was walking into wildly different environments, even though they all spoke Greek. We have the famous trio, Athens, Sparta, and Corinth. How did their unique characters shape the world the apostles found?
Well, let's start with Athens. Athens was, the cradle of democratic ideals, the absolute center of philosophy. It was a place where abstract thinking, debate, rhetoric, art, those were the highest virtues. The culture celebrated the mind.
So it's no surprise that when Paul gets there, the challenge isn't really moral decay, it's something else.
It's massive intellectual pride.
Right.
Exactly. They had too many gods and they had way too many ideas.
And then you have the complete opposite, Sparta.
Sparta was almost the antithesis of Athens. It was all about rigid military discipline, communal living, austerity, stoicism. Virtue wasn't about questioning reality. It was about absolute obedience and physical strength.
A completely different kind of human achievement.
A totally different challenge. Reaching a people dedicated to a state built on the sacrifice of the individual for military might. It's a very different wall to get through.
And then there's Corinth, which becomes so central to Paul's ministry later on.
Corinth was all about dynamism and commerce. It was strategically located on an isthmus, so it controlled the trade routes. Immense wealth just poured through that city, and that led to a culture of luxury, materialism, and famously, a lot of moral looseness.
I think the source mentioned the term to Corinthianize.
It did. It was ancient slang for engaging in sexual immorality. So the gospel's challenge in Corinth wasn't intellectual pride or military discipline. It was the overwhelming temptation of, urban life and unchecked worldliness. These 3 cities required 3 very different apostolic approaches.
But the things that really lasted, the exports from Greece that traveled further than any army, were its culture and its ideas.
Yeah.
We're talking about their art, their architecture, the theater. I always think about the great tragedians like Sophocles. They weren't just putting on plays for entertainment.
No, not at all. They were cultural guides. They were exploring these profound human questions about fate, dignity, human fragility. These tragic dramas, they were like a public forum where the Greeks could wrestle with ideas like divine justice and human freedom.
So they're trying to figure out morality in a world they saw as being run by these capricious gods.
That's right. And that sets a cultural expectation that life is governed by an impersonal fate, not by a loving personal creator.
And of course, you have the literary foundation, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These weren't just stories. The sources say they were more like cultural textbooks.
They absolutely were. These poems established the foundational ideals of what it meant to be a Greek hero: honor, courage, cunning, the pursuit of glory. Anyone in the first century, whether they were in Asia Minor or Egypt, would have known these stories.
So it created a shared baseline for ethics,
Hmm.
for what it meant to be virtuous.
Yes, but a baseline rooted entirely in human achievement and glory, not in humility or love for God. They were trying to define virtue without divine revelation, and that sets the stage perfectly for the gospel to come in and offer a stunning contrast.
Which brings us to the really big one, philosophy.
Yeah.
Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. These weren't just local wise men, were they? They were setting the very categories for all of Western thought.
Philosophy was Greece's greatest export. I mean, these thinkers laid the groundwork for metaphysics, for ethics, for how we even think about knowledge. Socrates forced people to examine their lives. Plato wrestled with the idea of the eternal forms versus our physical world, a concept that would, really influence later Christian thinking about the spiritual realm.
And Aristotle.
Aristotle, his student, was all about empirical observation and logical categories. He developed the tools of formal logic that theologians would end up using for centuries.
So they didn't just ask what is good. They developed the very vocabulary and the structure for how to even discuss truth and reality. That must have been a huge challenge when the simple message of a crucified Savior showed up.
It was a massive challenge
Hmm.
because they created an expectation that truth had to be reached through intellectual effort, through human reason and logic. If you couldn't defend your belief system with complex philosophical arguments, it was immediately suspicious to any educated Greek.
And then the geopolitical earthquake that made sure these ideas got everywhere. Alexander the Great. His conquests, starting around 336 BC, were just shockingly fast and huge. He goes all the way from the Near East to India.
This was the absolute turning point. And Alexander's vision wasn't just about seizing land. He wanted to create a unified world under one cultural banner. This military conquest led directly to what we call Hellenization.
Which the source defines as the systematic spread of Greek language and culture. Yeah. How did they actually do that? How did it get so deep into the fabric of society?
Well, they used a few key tools. First, they founded cities, like Alexandria in Egypt, which became these hubs of Greek administration and culture. Second, they built institutions like the gymnasia and theaters. The gymnasium wasn't just for sports. It was the center of Greek education. It was where the next generation of local elites got steeped in Greek thought, literature, and lifestyle.
So if you wanted power or prestige, you had to speak and think like a Greek.
You had to. It essentially created a common cultural and linguistic environment across the entire known world.
And that leads to this great historical paradox our source points out, which I find so fascinating. Rome conquers Greece politically in 146 BC. Rome is the military master, and yet Greek remains the dominant language.
That is the single most pivotal insight for anyone studying the New Testament. Latin was the language of the government, the legions, the administration, but Greek, specifically Koine Greek, the common dialect, was the language of everything else. Commerce, philosophy, literature, and just daily conversation between people from different places. It was the shared voice of the empire.
The original lingua franca.
Exactly. It was understood from one end of the Mediterranean to the other.
So what does this all mean for us as believers? The source is very clear, calling this no accident, but providence. How do we understand this as God deliberately preparing the world?
This is where we shift from history to theology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would God, in his sovereignty, make sure that a single precise language from a pagan humanistic culture would dominate the world right before Jesus arrives? The answer is all about effectiveness and speed for the gospel.
No translation barrier.
Exactly. The unifying force of Koine Greek meant the evangelist could write the message once, reliably, in Greek, and it could be disseminated instantly across all these different cultural and national boundaries. It could reach Jews and Gentiles alike.
It's just incredible to think about. The very forces that were meant to unify the world under Greek philosophy were instead used by God as the perfect vehicle to carry the revelation of Jesus Christ.
That's it. God prepared the physical world with Roman roads and Roman peace, the Pax Romana, but he prepared the intellectual and communicative world through the Greek language. This is what allowed the New Testament itself to be written, preserved, and spread so uniformly and so quickly. It's a clear act of divine timing. It shows God works even through secular, even pagan systems to achieve his sacred ends.
That idea of providence is the perfect bridge into our second section, the biblical narrative. We see the gospel actually encountering this Hellenized world. And even though Jesus' main focus was on the lost sheep of Israel, the reach of Greek culture was just everywhere.
It was inescapable, and the sources point to this beautiful, subtle moment in John chapter 12, right before the Passion Week, that signals this wider mission. Some Greeks, they were probably Gentile converts to Judaism or maybe just curious seekers, they come to Philip.
And they say, "Sir, we would like to see Jesus."
Yes. And it seems like a small detail, but it's profoundly symbolic, especially because of the timing. Jesus is in Jerusalem for Passover, fulfilling his role as the Jewish Messiah. But the arrival of these Greeks is this critical signpost. It foreshadows the global path of the gospel.
And what's Jesus' response? He doesn't go talk to them right away.
No, his response is to say, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." The connection there implies that the glorification, the cross and resurrection, is necessary precisely because the mission is now widening beyond Israel out to the Gentile world that these Greeks represent. Their presence signals that the old promises are starting to be fulfilled.
And we also see Jesus ministering directly in those Hellenized regions, like the Decapolis. That was a cluster of 10 cities east of the Jordan that were fundamentally Greek in their culture.
Right, which shows his intentionality. He didn't just stay in Galilee and Judea. He deliberately went into areas saturated with Greek culture. When he cast out the demons from the man in the region of the Gadarenes, what did the people do?
They asked him to leave.
They asked him to leave. They were focused on their pigs, on their commerce. It was a very Hellenized commercial reaction to this divine disruption. It just confirms the message of the kingdom was already being declared in the Greek-speaking world during Jesus' own life.
And maybe the most powerful example of a Greek-speaking Gentile intersecting with Jewish faith is the Syrophoenician woman in Mark chapter 7.
Oh, that narrative is so powerful. She is explicitly called a Greek. And her interaction with Jesus, her persistence, her sharp, faithful reply to his analogy about the children's bread and the dogs, is just a stunning display.
And it leads to her daughter's healing.
Which demonstrates so powerfully that the blessings of the Messiah were never meant to be limited by ethnicity. Her faith just leaps over those boundaries. It was a visible sign that God's intent was always inclusion.
But the real head-to-head confrontation, where the Greek philosophical spirit really met the gospel, we see that in the book of Acts through Paul's missionary journeys. This is where we see those two big Greek challenges, the intellectual and the moral.
Precisely. And we should really focus on Athens and Corinth because they offer such a perfect contrast. They show the different ways the gospel was received, how it was rejected, and how it was struggled with inside the church.
Let's start with Athens, the heart of intellectualism. Paul standing before the philosophers on the Areopagus, on Mars Hill. That's one of the most incredible moments in missionary history. How did he even approach their audience? They must have been so skeptical.
Paul showed just astonishing cultural wisdom. He didn't come in swinging, condemning everything. He started with connection. His strategy is really a model for us. First, he just observed. He saw the city was full of idols, but he also acknowledged their religious devotion.
He found a bridge.
He found a cultural bridge, the altar inscribed to the unknown God. He affirmed their deep but obviously unmet religious longing. He was basically saying, the God you're trying to find, the one you're already dimly aware of, I'm here to tell you who he really is.
And he even quotes their own poets, right? He's showing respect for their tradition.
He does. He quotes their own thinkers, saying, for in him we live and move and have our being. He's establishing common ground. He uses their own cultural framework, their poets, their altars, their religious impulse, as the springboard to then redirect all of that toward the true creator God.
It sounds like a brilliant strategy. It's the model we often praise for modern apologetics. But, the critique is that the results were pretty minimal compared to other places. Was Athens really a success?
That's a really good question, and it forces us to define success biblically. If you measure it by the number of converts, no, Athens was one of Paul's least fruitful stops. The text mentions Dionysius and a woman named Damaris and a few others. It wasn't a big, bustling church like in Corinth.
Where was the success?
The success was in the model itself. Paul showed that you have to engage the culture where it is, using its language, before you deliver the sharp edge of the gospel. He proved the message is intellectually robust enough to stand before the greatest minds of the age, even if those minds reject it. The rejection wasn't a failure of the gospel. It was a failure of human wisdom to humble itself.
And what was the specific point where that sophisticated Greek audience just stumbled? Where did he lose them?
The resurrection. When Paul proclaimed that this unknown God was calling for repentance and had appointed a man to judge the world, and that he'd given proof of this by raising him from the dead, that's when they started to mock him.
Why was that so offensive to them?
For the Greek philosophers, especially those influenced by Plato, the physical body was often seen as a prison for the pure, eternal spirit. The idea of the body being restored, resurrected, that was philosophical nonsense to them. It was a return to imperfection. It was scandalous to their intellect. Human wisdom collided with divine revelation right there.
Okay, now let's shift to Corinth. If Athens was the intellectual challenge, Corinth was the moral, urban challenge. Paul's strategy there had to be totally different.
It was completely different. Corinth was this major cosmopolitan trade hub, famous for its wealth and the immorality that so often comes with it. Paul spent 18 months there planting a church, but his letters to them, 1 and 2 Corinthians, show just how deeply the city's culture had infected the believers.
You see all these problems, divisions, lawsuits, spiritual pride, and just awful immorality, even incest.
Exactly. The Corinthian Christians were trying to live out the gospel while still operating by their city's values. They prized status, they valued flashy rhetorical skill over substance, and they allowed for all this moral looseness because they thought spiritual freedom meant freedom from all ethical rules.
So Paul's message to them had to be a direct refutation of that Greek ethos.
It was a direct and harsh refutation, especially of their love for human Sophia, human wisdom. He confronts them head-on in 1 Corinthians. He tells them the world, by its wisdom, did not know God. He forces them to choose between their city's values and the divine simplicity of the message of the cross.
Which was considered Moria foolishness by the Greeks.
Yes, but Paul insists that this very foolishness is the power of God for salvation. The issues in Corinth weren't academic debates. They're intense, practical, moral failures that came directly from this focus on worldly achievement and sophistication.
The sources also mentioned a detail from even earlier in Acts 6 that shows this cultural friction was there from the very beginning, even in Jerusalem, the appointment of the deacons.
Yes, that's such a crucial detail. It shows the church had to manage these cultural divides right away. You had the Hellenistic Jews, the Greek-speaking ones who had adopted some Greek customs, and they felt their widows were being overlooked in the daily food distribution.
Compared to the Hebraic Jews who spoke Aramaic.
Right. And this wasn't a theological argument. It was about justice and cultural preference. The solution, appointing 7 men to serve, shows the church's immediate need to create structures that ensure unity and justice across those cultural lines. It confirms that Greeks were central players from the very start.
So if we accept this historical reality that God set up the whole system, the language, the roads, the intellectual framework, the question isn't just how he did it, but the deeper why. Let's move into section 3, the theological significance of all this.
This takes us right to the heart of providence. The Greek dominance of language and thought wasn't an historical accident, it was part of God's deliberate plan. And we need to see Greece in the context of God's larger use of Gentile empires throughout history.
How does Greece fit that pattern with, say, Babylon or Persia?
Well, God consistently used powerful empires for his purposes with Israel. He used Babylon for discipline, for judgment, sending them into exile. He used Persia for restoration, authorizing and financing their return to rebuild the temple.
But Greece's role is different.
It was different. It wasn't primarily for discipline or restoration. It was for worldwide preparation. Preparation linguistically and culturally for the coming of Christ.
Creating the perfect infrastructure for the gospel to launch.
That's exactly it. The Greek language was preserved through all the political chaos after Alexander, kept as the perfect vessel to carry the divine revelation of the New Testament. This ensures a linguistic uniformity and clarity for the foundational documents of our faith. It's just undeniable evidence of God's timing.
And this leads us to that core doctrinal struggle Paul faced, the defining contrast between human wisdom and divine wisdom. This is the great theological battle that had to be fought in the most intellectually charged culture the world had ever seen.
Yes, and we have to slow down and look at that key passage in 1 Corinthians 1.22-23. Paul just boils down the entire world's reaction to the gospel into 2 categories. He says, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified.
A stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles.
Exactly. He simplifies all human resistance into two camps. You either want a miraculous demonstration or you want a satisfying logical explanation.
The Jew wanted empirical proof of God's power. The Greek wanted a system that satisfied their rational mind.
And Paul says, I'm not giving you either one. I'm giving you the cross. And we have to ask why the cross was foolishness, Romiet, to them. The Greek philosophical tradition prized reason, self-control, freedom from suffering. A God who was weak enough to be executed, to suffer humiliation on a criminal's cross, that was a total contradiction to their concept of divine perfection.
So their own human brilliance could never logically deduce or accept a saving God who became a victim.
Never. And that makes the cross the great leveler. It removes the grounds for both Jewish and Greek pride. It insists on a truth that requires humble surrender, not intellectual mastery.
It's the ultimate critique of human self-sufficiency.
It is. Paul argues that God deliberately chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. The wisdom of the Greeks failed precisely because it was too proud to accept salvation that came through a method crucifixion that the world saw as contemptible. Salvation isn't a prize for being smart. It's a gift accepted by humble faith.
In this inclusion of the Greeks, it connects directly to that third theme, the universality of salvation. This is what the Old Testament was pointing to all along.
Absolutely. The seeking Greeks in Jerusalem, Paul's Gentile ministry, the founding of these Gentile majority churches. This is the physical manifestation of God fulfilling the promise to Abraham, that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. It was God demonstrating that the scope of redemption was truly cosmic.
The sources also make a really crucial, nuanced point about the complexities of this. While Hellenization enabled the gospel to spread, those Greek philosophical categories weren't always a perfect fit for biblical revelation, were they?
This is a vital point. The early church fathers, many of whom were highly educated in Greek philosophy men like Justin Martyr, they used the categories of Greek thought to explain Christian doctrine. A perfect example is the concept of the logos, or the word.
How did they use that concept? What was the tension there?
Well, the Greek philosophical tradition understood the logos as this impersonal, eternal reason, the logical structure of the universe. The church fathers, and especially John in his gospel, they co-opted this familiar term. John starts, in the beginning was the word, logos, and the word was with God, and the word was God.
So he takes a word they know.
He takes a word they understand to mean reason, but he immediately redefines it. He proclaims that the ultimate reason of the universe isn't some impersonal force, it's a person who became flesh, Jesus Christ. This was strategically brilliant. It enabled the faith to be defended in the intellectual arenas of the day.
But there was always a risk.
Always. The risk was that when human philosophical ideas, like that body-spirit dualism we talked about, were prioritized over the plain teaching of Scripture, errors got introduced. This led to a lot of the later theological controversies the church had to fight through. It shows God's sovereignty working through the culture, but it also shows the constant need for us to make sure the culture never dictates our theology.
And finally, let's ground this prophetically. The sources mention Daniel's visions, which identify Greece as a major world power long before Alexander was even born.
This just underscores that the rise of Greece wasn't random. It was predicted and programmed into God's timetable. In Daniel chapter 2, Greece is the belly and thighs of bronze in that statue. Then in Daniel 8, it's symbolized by that swift male goat with the big horn Alexander who crushes the Persian ram.
And when that horn is broken, 4 lesser horns come up.
The successor kingdoms that cemented Hellenization. That level of prophetic detail just reinforces the truth that their rise was foreseen and orchestrated to peak precisely when the Messiah would appear. The entire world stage was prepared down to the smallest detail.
That powerful foundation brings us right to our final section, the spiritual lessons and application. This is where we bring it all home, acknowledging the similarities between ancient Athens and our world today.
And we have to start with the main lesson. The warning against intellectual pride. The Greeks were brilliant. They invented so much of Western thought, but that very brilliance often became the main barrier to their faith. They were unwilling to believe something their own reason couldn't sign off on.
How does that look in our modern world? We place such a high value on education, science, empirical proof. Faith is often dismissed as being primitive or anti-intellectual.
Our age is so similar to Athens. We elevate academic achievement, the scientific method, technological progress as the ultimate judges of truth. And just like with the Greeks, these things aren't evil, they're wonderful gifts from God. But we have to learn the lesson of 1 Corinthians. Human brilliance, no matter how sophisticated, cannot save the soul. It cannot discover the wisdom of God on its own.
It's that constant temptation to think that if we're just smart enough or sophisticated enough, we won't need the so-called foolishness of the cross.
That's it exactly. We have to guard against that subtle pride that thinks complexity equals holiness, or that a PhD exempts us from simple childlike faith. Salvation rests entirely in the crucified and risen Christ. The application for us is to resist being ashamed of the gospel when it gets dismissed by the academy or the media. We stand on divine revelation, not human credentials.
Which then leads to the mandate for cultural engagement, which Paul models so perfectly in Athens. He didn't run from the culture, but he didn't just assimilate into it either.
Paul's model is the blueprint. He acknowledged their poets, their longings, their partial truths, but he never compromised the distinctiveness of the biblical message. He didn't water down the cross to make it more palatable. He just found the right bridge to carry its profound truth across.
So Christians today are called to do the same, to faithfully interact with our culture and politics, science, the arts, bringing every thought captive to Christ.
And that engagement is a difficult balance, isn't it? If you engage too closely, you risk becoming like the Corinthians, just assimilating the world's values. If you retreat too far, you risk irrelevance, completely ignoring Paul's model.
It's a perpetual tension.
It is. Paul showed you have to understand the culture's operating assumptions, know their poets, understand their altars, but you must always speak the truth from God, not just adapt the truth to the culture. Our job isn't to win a philosophical argument. It's to point to the person who is the answer to all philosophy.
And the success of the Greek language spreading the gospel reminds us that God is always seizing modern avenues for his purposes, even the ones that seem totally secular.
This is a huge encouragement. God used Hellenization, a geopolitical strategy from pagan kings, as his communication medium. We have to ask, what's the lingua franca of our generation? It's not Greek anymore. It's digital technology, global media. These are the common roads of our age.
So the church has a mandate to leverage these tools for the proclamation of Christ.
Absolutely. God is just as sovereign over fiber optics and translation apps as he was over Greek grammar and Roman roads. We have to use these tools with wisdom and discernment to proclaim Christ in the shared voice of our global village. If we don't, we're neglecting a massive providential opportunity.
And finally, the ultimate lesson from the Greeks is the call to have a steadfast confidence in the message, even when it's mocked.
The world is always obsessed with progress and intellectual mastery. To many, the message of the cross seems old, weak, simplistic. It is still moria, foolishness to the learned. And this requires deep humility and conviction from us as believers. We're called to stand fast, knowing that when the learned or the powerful dismiss our faith as folly, we hold the very wisdom of God. We don't defend the cross by making it less scandalous. We simply declare its power.
This has been such an insightful journey. We've really traced the dual legacy of the Greeks. They were both a formidable challenge because of their intellectual pride, and at the same time, a crucial testimony to God's meticulous providential preparation of the world for the gospel.
And the central insight for us today is so clear. No culture, no matter how advanced or beautiful or profound, holds the key to salvation apart from Christ. All human achievement, when you measure it against the truth of God, it just falls short.
To bring this all home, let's return to that one passage that just captures the entire tension we've been talking about. It's from 1 Corinthians 1, verse 18. It says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God."
That verse is both a profound warning and a mighty encouragement. It's a warning to be so careful about where we place our trust, to be wary of elevating human speculation over divine revelation. But it's also a tremendous encouragement, because it clarifies where our strength really comes from. Our complete confidence and power are found not in our intellect or our cultural relevance, but in that simple, profound message of the cross.
May you stand firm in the power and the wisdom of God that's revealed in Christ today and always.